Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome, guys. Welcome to our February study group. These are going to be the modules that we're going to be covering. So ideally, everybody has gone in and walked through those and done some practice with them prior to us getting together today. I will say that a lot of the information in the first two modules is pretty similar. So hopefully we're feeling really good about that as we move forward with our terminology review. If you guys have any questions, any concerns, anything along the way, go on ahead and take yourselves off mute or enter into that chat function. I am monitoring that as well. But let's go ahead and walk on through our terminology section. So the first question that I am going to ask you is, what is the definition of cultural competency? If I were to come at you and say, I'm culturally competent, what would that make you think? Janet wrote in the chat, and she says, being competent with the practices of various cultures. Deb, I saw you came off mute. Did you have something to add?
Maybe also just being aware of your own cultural beliefs and what you know about other cultures.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Anybody else? So cultural competency is going to be the ability. So if I'm culturally competent, this is talking about my ability to understand and respect someone else's values, attitudes, beliefs, whatever that may be. I may not hold the same, but I understand that, and I am respectful of that other culture, right? If I were, and Shay, being aware of how other cultures may be different from you. Absolutely.
It's a high.
I was about to say Shaylee, and I was like, that's not right.
It's okay.
Say hi. That's beautiful. Awesome. Thank you so much. So, okay, so we've talked about cultural competency. Cultural competency is saying, I am the expert, I understand, I know you, I've got you, I'm going to respect you and all of your values, attitudes, and beliefs. Now I'm turning around and I'm asking you cultural humility. So what is cultural humility? There's a slight difference between the two. So culturally competent, we're saying, I'm the expert, I've got this. So Janet just wrote in the chat, she says, recognizing that you are not the expert of other people's cultures and being willing to learn from them. Absolutely. Somebody else come off mute? So absolutely, Janet. So essentially we're saying, I'm not the expert in what you're doing. I'm not, but I'm willing to learn, right? I don't know everything that there is to know about your culture, but I am here, I am present, and I am willing to take that step. So this is going to be that lifelong process of reflecting within ourselves, taking personal stock and saying, what do I have going on? What do I know? What are maybe some gaps that I need to be filling? And then learning from every person, every family, every situation, every experience that you are having. So where I kept saying cultural competency is that I am the expert. Cultural humility is really taking that step back and saying, I'm not the expert, but you are, right? I also think that cultural humility is coming with an ever evolving set of attitudes, skills, and behaviors. This is a state where we are constantly in a place of growth, right? We're constantly looking at what we have, what we know, and how we can get ourselves to the next step of better understanding different cultures. When we were taking the modules for cultural competency and cultural humility, there were actually 3 principles that were listed out in one of the modules specific to cultural humility. Does anybody remember what any one of those 3 were? And if not, if you didn't take them, you can say that too, but they were in there. And so we're going to cover all 3 of them. Janet took the modules because Janet just said self-reflection. Yes, you are absolutely correct. Principle number 1 is self-reflection. Does anybody remember any of the other 3 principles? So principle number 1 is self-reflection. Do you guys remember 2 or 3? And it's okay if you don't. That's why we're here. Okay. Well, let's dive on into that first one then. So as Janet mentioned in the chat function, principle number 1 is going to be self-reflection. This is where we are, again, like I mentioned in our last slide, we are going to be taking stock of ourselves, and we are going to try to better understand whatever we constitute within ourselves as other. So whatever cultures are different beyond our own, right? We're going to be taking next steps to try to figure out where we're at in that process. I am so sorry, you guys, 1 second. Where we're at in that process and how we can grow and learn more. So some questions that we're going to be asking ourselves are going to be things like, what is my own culture? What does that look like? What is it? Because you might not even know. This might not be a question that had been asked previously. It just might not be something that had crossed your thought process, but some good questions to ask during this principal stage of cultural humility are, what is my own culture? How does my personal culture impact my view of the world and the people within it? When I'm working with clients, what are some initial reactions that I may have to them? Especially those who have different cultural backgrounds than I do. Another great question would be something akin to, how do I value the input that I'm getting from those clients? So my clients have wildly different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds than what I do. And they're talking with me about that. How am I taking that information in, and what value am I placing on that, right? Additional questions might be, how do I make space within my practice, within the work that I'm doing, for clients to be able to share their own identities and to be able to speak with me about their cultural differences. So self-reflection, this is an ever-growing, ever-changing, always learning process, and self-reflection is going to be the first core principle of good practiced cultural humility. So principle number 2 is going to be recognizing challenges and power imbalances, right? So basically, how do my behaviors challenge power imbalances, right? That's what we're going to be asking. So we know that power imbalances are out there in this world. We know that they exist. Unfortunately, a lot of us have probably experienced them. But when we're talking about being, having cultural humility, when we're talking about that, and we're talking about the work that we are doing, we want to make sure that we are not just acknowledging that power imbalances exist within the world and within our work. We also want to make sure that we are thinking about what we are doing to challenge those, right? So, for example, when we're looking at families, a good question that you might ask a client or yourself when you're working with a client is, what issues are my client having that might be specifically related to oppression or systemic issues? Is there something within, my day-to-day tasks that I can do that can challenge those issues that this client is facing? Another question might be, what are some social and economic barriers that are keeping families that you're working with from accessing services? Both of those are really great questions to ask, just to be able to look at what's going on in the work that you're doing and where are families maybe struggling a little bit more that you wouldn't have paid attention to without practicing that cultural humility, or you wouldn't maybe have been able to put your finger on, not necessarily not pay attention to, but put your finger on, name, and then think about how you can challenge that. And the third principle was going to be that institutional accountability. So this is essentially saying, what are the strengths and challenges of the places that you work and the ability to provide services across cultures? So is there something within the program that you're working, the practice that you're doing, that you can look at and say, I think that it would just be a little bit more equitable if we practiced this way as opposed to this way. We would be able to reach more of our families and be more culturally competent and humorous in this if we were, practicing X, Y, and Z as opposed to A, B, and C. That is the third principle. So essentially, again, throughout this process, we are ever growing and ever changing and ever learning. So we're looking at ourselves, we're looking at our family level of, what's that looking like for them? And then we're also looking at an institutional level. So we are ideally looking through three various lenses at power imbalances and some strengths and some barriers for the people and the individuals that we're working with. Are there any questions about that? Because the next space that we're going to walk into is the 5 R's of culture. And this was in another module that you guys should have taken a peek at before we met together. So if I were to come to you and say, what are the 5 R's of culture? What would you say? If you could just name one, what are one of the R's of culture, the 5 R's of cultural humility? Janet's nailing this today. She just wrote in the chat and she said respect. Absolutely. That is one of the 5. Can anybody name anything else? Hint, they all start with R, guys.
Reflection.
Absolutely. Thank you. So we have respect, reflection. Anybody have any other
Regard.
ideas? Regard. Thank you. Yeah. Reflection, respect, regard. Tiffany just wrote in, she said resiliency. And the very last one, I'll give you guys just a second. If you guys don't know it, that's okay. The very last R. So we have reflection, respect, regard, and resiliency. Very last R is going to be relevance, right? So doing a quick review of those, just so that way there, you guys have a great idea of how these 5 R words are playing into culture. When we are talking about reflection, we are really wanting people to approach every encounter with humility and the understanding that you can learn something from every individual and every encounter that you have. So when we are saying reflection, we're keeping that in mind. You can learn something from every encounter that you have. Respect, this one's kind of a given. Aretha said it best. We want some RESPECT in our lives. And that's just basically, we want to make sure that we are treating every person with the utmost respect, and we are striving to treat them with dignity as well. When we are talking about regard, we are holding every person in their highest regard while being aware of and not allowing unconscious bias to interfere with those interactions. When we are talking about relevance, we are saying that we expect cultural humility to be relevant for you in every interaction that you have. And when we are talking about resiliency, we are considering how the practice of cultural humility can help with your own personal resilience. Are there any questions about the 5 R's of culture?
Reflection, respect.
Absolutely. Reflection, respect, regard, relevance, and resiliency. Any questions on those? Okay. So now I have a quick definition for you guys. If I were to ask you, what does acculturation, if I can get it out, acculturation mean, what would you say to me? What does acculturation mean? I've always been
Conforming,
go
I'm
ahead. No, go.
conforming to maybe the norm or the majority culture.
Yeah. So when I think of this word, I think of like assimilation, where essentially, you're popped into a place that you're kind of unfamiliar with, so you start to take on some behaviors and practices, maybe values of that new pool that you've been dropped into, right? I see some chats coming in. Janet says, adopting cultural practices that are different from your own. And Laura says, adopt the culture, but keep the old culture. And that is hitting the nail on the head. So we are essentially going to be adopting some practices and some values of another culture, but we're still going to hold on to what we know of our own, right? How about linguistic diversity? And this is like such a fancy word for language, but if I were to say linguistic diversity to you, what would you guys think about that?
Being multilingual.
Yeah, kind of. So there's going to be different speaking traits, right? So like, for example, you guys are all really Southern. And so I know that you'll be saying y'all to me when you come off mute, right? And that might not be something that, if I'm here in this little Midwest world, that I would be as familiar with. Even something as tiny as that is so different. We're speaking the same language, but we use different words for things. Like, for example, for the longest time after moving to Iowa, people say wash. It's not wash, it's wash. And even that little piece is considered linguistic diversity within our own country. So imagine how different various languages are across, of course, the world. So linguistic diversity, when we are talking about that, is we're talking about different types of speaking traits. So grammar that you're using, vocabulary that you're using, language that you're using, those are going to be used by adults who are learning English and who prefer to only speak their home language. So this will also incorporate and include kiddos who are learning English in the home and they're fluent in their home language. So you might see linguistic diversity popping up with them. You will see kiddos that are growing up as dual language learners, and they will be fluent in both their home language and then English. You will see kiddos that are learning both at once, that are maybe fluent in one and not quite so much the other one just yet. But all of that is to say, they're learning, and they're going to have that differences in the way that they're expressing and communicating because of those dual language rules, right? So there's something that happens when you have a lot of linguistic diversity, and especially when we have kiddos who are dual language learners growing up in a home, and that is called code switching. Can anybody tell me what the definition of code switching is? And I see this, like one of my best friends, she's from the Philippines and she is my age. So she's in her 30s. But English is her second language. And when we have conversations, sometimes she will do code switching without realizing it. So I don't know if anybody can using words. Yes. So Laura goes using words from two languages, essentially. Yes. So sometimes, and when my friend does this, when she does code switching, she's essentially having a conversation and maybe in Tagalog, which is the traditional language in the Philippines is Tagalog. There might not be a proper term for something in Tagalog, like what we have in English. And so she will start talking and she'll just keep going. She'll be speaking in Tagalog and then you'll see her stop. She'll flip, say that English version of whatever that word is, and then she'll keep going in Tagalog. It is one of the coolest freaking things I have ever seen in my life. And if anybody on here can speak multiple languages, you guys are amazing. Chef's kiss to you because that's just awesome. And so very difficult. But we'll see this in kiddos too. So our littles, rather than maybe not knowing what that term is, they might actually be talking to us. And depending on what person they're talking to, or depending on the setting, just kind of their comfort level, etc., they might flip between words or between languages without even realizing it. So for example, I think in the modules, they used an example of a little girl who was talking to her parents. One spoke English, one spoke Spanish, and she was asking for her cup. But the only word that she said in Spanish was cup. And the rest of the sentence was in complete English. So, English, 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 Spanish, cup. This is called code switching. Another thing is if they're trying to place an emphasis on a specific word or action, they might say that in the opposing language or in a different language as opposed to the remainder of the sentence, if that makes sense. So it really just kind of bases off of who we're talking to, what we're talking about, what the situation is. But anytime you see kind of that weaving in and out of languages, that is called code switching. Does that make sense? Everybody feel pretty comfortable with that? Has anybody seen somebody do that? Because I think it's just literally the coolest thing. And can you tell I wish I had paid more attention in French in high school?
One of my best friends lives in South America now, and her kids constantly go back and forth between English and Spanish. It's pretty cool.
It's so cool. And they're so little, you guys. And kids they can absorb so much. It is amazing. I had a professor who his wife spoke French and English, and he spoke Spanish and English. And they hired a German nanny. And then, kudos to them because they clearly had lots of money. But they hired this nanny who spoke like German and I think Chinese or something like that. So by the time their children were getting to be 10, 11, 12, they had like 6 languages under their belt. And I want to know exactly the amount of code switching that was happening in that house, because I can guarantee you my kid could like yell at me and I would have no idea what they were saying. It would just be amazing. I would love it. Deborah says, yes, I've seen it during visits with my Spanish speaking clients. Absolutely. So we'll see that happen a lot in our day-to-day interactions with families. She also said, wow, yeah, they were archaeologists. So I'm pretty sure that's why they knew all of these languages, but super cool to watch and to know that like kids can just take that in, they can absorb it, and it's not going to take them any longer to learn. They catch up with our solo, language speakers just fine, but it's so awesome to watch that. All right. So moving on from code switching, now we are moving into content from our last and final module, which was regarding historical trauma. You guys, if you guys have not taken this module yet, and if you're just here to listen and to hear kind of what it's about, Love that, but also please sit back and take this historical trauma module. It is probably my favorite on the entire institute, just because of the content that it gives. And I just think it's so beautiful and it's so well done. 10 out of 10 would recommend this for you guys, just for personal growth, development, whatever you want to utilize it as. But it's just fantastic. Some of the personal stories in this module are really awesome. Okay, so moving into historical trauma. If I were to come at you and I was to say, historical trauma, what does that mean to you? What would be the definition I would get back? Somebody said, yeah, I think they've got some historical trauma going on.
Trauma maybe that was passed on from ancestors.
Nailed it. Yeah. So historical trauma is going to be the legacy, which nobody wants. Nobody wants historical trauma. But it's going to be the legacy of numerous traumatical events through a community that a community will experience over generations. So Janet wrote, trauma experienced within a culture that affects later generations. Absolutely. Can you guys name any instances of historical trauma that you can think of? We have several in this world.
The Holocaust.
Slavery.
Slavery and the Holocaust. Boom. The two glaring, horrific things that our country has done. Yeah, the Holocaust is a great example of historical trauma. Slavery is another one. Any type of genocide is going to be up there. Oh my gosh, the concentration camps that we currently have on our borders, those are going to create historical trauma. Janet wrote Native Americans. If you guys, the whitewashing that occurred of the Native American culture, that was another big thing. And I do just want to take a moment to say it can be just emotional. It can be physiological. It doesn't have to be just one or the other. Historical trauma can just be emotionally based. It doesn't necessarily have to be physically based, but typically you see it come down both pipes. Another thing, and we have yet to see how this is going to play out, but even the pandemic, what we all just went through, that is going to create some historical trauma. It's not necessarily one singular person that was creating the mayhem like Hitler did. But I think that we're going to see a lot of emotional concerns coming out of the pandemic and what we just had happen with losing family members and things like that. So there are going to be 3 key components to historical trauma. And I am just going to list them out for you guys. So the first is that whenever we're talking about historical trauma, it's going to be individuals within a community-wide area that are broadly experiencing the same traumatic event. So we think Holocaust, we think slavery. Holocaust was obviously a lot of Jewish individuals who were all widely experiencing the same level of genocide. Another component is going to be that historically, traumatic events create high levels of collective distress and mourning. So again, like pandemic, we might not automatically think like this is going to create historical trauma, but did the pandemic not come in and create a lot of distress and mourning throughout the world? It did. And then the third component is that it's created by outsiders, usually with a negative intent. I will say that there are various ways that historical trauma can be brought upon a population. Any type of discrimination, any type of oppression, forced relocation. So I know when Janet said Native Americans, they were forced to migrate and relocate from their tribes and their lands. Systematic erasures. So any type of genocide, massacre, or oppressive laws and policies geared towards one group of people. And And essentially what this is going to lead to is we're going to have a lot of unhealthy growth and development, right? Because this is happening on a large scale, it feels very overwhelming. And we're going to maybe unintentionally pass that down through generations. Any questions about historical trauma and what that would look like? And we have tons. And that's why I say, please, please, please go through that module, because there's so many really great personal stories in there that I just think, as family support workers, I would want everybody to look at and to watch and to know, not necessarily just so you guys can pass the certification exam, but just because it's just a really damn good module, you guys. And I'm sorry for swearing, it's just really good. All right. Next on my list of terminology that we need to know to be prepped and ready for passing our exam is survivor syndrome. What is the definition of survivor syndrome? Janet says, it's interesting that a byproduct of historical trauma is cultural resiliency. Absolutely. Any idea about the survivor syndrome definition? This is going to be really dorky, but have a lot of you guys seen Grey's Anatomy? And I say this, why did I get to live? Guilt felt by survivors, guilt that you did not suffer what others did. Absolutely. These are all great definitions of survivor syndrome. So the way that I remember this is I think about the episode of Grey's Anatomy where their plane crashes and a lot of people die. And then I think Owen has he has survivor syndrome because, you know, he did not get on the plane. He put them on the plane. And I don't know if anybody watches Grey's Anatomy, but it's just a great way to keep that in mind, is the plane crash with all of them. I'm just saying. I cry every time I see that episode. I know, Tiffany. Lexi, we lost Lexi that day. I'm shooketh by it. But what are some symptoms if I were to say, okay, I think Tiffany's suffering with some survivor syndrome? What are some symptoms that you would maybe see presenting in Tiffany? Janet says depression and anger, depression and guilt. Absolutely. I think about nightmares being pretty big, night terrors, nightmares, lack of sleep, agitation. So that level of irritability where they just constantly seem like they're on edge. I know we said depression, but I always feel like depression goes hand in hand a little bit with anxiety. So you might see some of that. You might see collective denial, where it's essentially just a defense mechanism, where they're saying, you know, I'm just going to ignore this. This didn't happen. I'm going to block this out. I'm going to say this never occurred because it's easier to protect myself than to have the repeated memories of what happened. Laura says fear. Absolutely. Terror, scaredness. Any type of survivor's guilt, which Laura also named off. So those are all going to be some pretty heavy signs and symptoms that there's a little bit of survivor syndrome going on. Okay, moving into our reflective questions. Can you guys name one of the 3 principles of cultural humility? So I said there were 3 of them and we went through them all together, but can you guys name one of them? If not all 3. Okay, so I see some self-reflections coming in. Okay, so we have level 1, the self-reflection, the internal work. Then we bump up to principle number 2 was looking at
Imbalances.
Yep. So number 2 was more looking at, all right, so what are these power imbalances that are happening? What can we do on our end to help this family and to help them with their struggle? And what was the very third one, the very last one? So we've got the me, we've got the we, and then Annette just wrote in there the institutional accountability. Yes. And we've got the they, the me, the we, and the they is the way that I keep that in my mind. So I'm looking at myself, I'm looking at what's going on with the folks around me, and I'm looking at the places that I belong to in our community, whether that be a church, whether that be the program that you're working in, whether that be, you know, a local community board that you sit on, whatever that may be. And we're looking at those to say, okay, how can we make this more equitable and more aligned with cultural humility? All right, next question. You are working with a family that is raising a dual language learner. You notice the child frequently switches between languages to emphasize a point. What is this called? And I know everybody knows this one because I loved it so much. Code switching. Yes, thank you, Laura. This is called code switching. Okay. Third and final question. Give an example of events that can create historical trauma. So remember, I named off a bunch of things that can create historical trauma. War, economic depression, genocide, pandemics, slavery, absolutely. All of those things none of us really want to participate in. Absolutely. So you guys have nailed it. I want to, before we do anything else, I want you guys to know these are going to be the modules that we are going to be working on for March. When we have our March presentation, that's where we are going to talk a little bit more about testing and what that will look like. Full disclosure, the certification exam has been down since October, and we have been working to get that back up with a new proctor. We are in the midst of that, and I believe the estimated launch is going to be in March. So we should be all set for everybody to take that October 12th testing date. I will keep you guys in the loop about that as I learn more. But keep in mind that next time when we meet, we're not just going to go through these modules, but we're also going to talk about the test itself and how maybe we can alleviate some of that testing anxiety. Just to give you guys a clearer picture of what it's going to look like for you when you are sitting on a proctored exam. If you've never done one proctored before, it can be kind of weird to feel like you have somebody just watching you. But we'll get through that and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we are back in March. Are there any questions about anything that we talked about today in regards to terminology or reflective questions or the content in general? Otherwise, I will be sending this PowerPoint out to everybody who registered on the Institute. So I will send out all of the slides. My notes are all plugged in there, so you guys can take a peek at those as well. And then just review these 4 modules before we come back together in March and be prepared for us to dive into that actual testing conversation, because you're so close. You guys are so close to going through it together. Any questions?
Christy, I have a question. I had April was when we would be taking the test. Did you just mention October?
Oh, no. So October I did mention. So we actually lost well, the certification exam went down in October, so that way it could be hooked up with a new proctoring company. But yes, you guys are slated to take the test on April 12th.
12. Okay. Because I was planning my vacation around that, so I was making sure I had that.
Well, that's incredibly important. Yes. Don't change vacation plans. April 12th is the date that you guys are scheduled for taking that. And I will have to, because I know Katryn's gone, so I will just link up with whomever has taken over her role and make sure that we have all hands on deck for that and for getting you guys registered and signed up. Okay. Any other
Thank you.
questions? Absolutely. I'm kind of bummed because I only have one more study group with you guys and then I don't see you anymore. And I don't know how I'm going to get my y'alls in without you ladies. Anyway. All right. Well, that is all that I have. I'm going to email out the slides again. I will send the link to get it added to your guys' YouTube content page. And then I will see you guys back here in a month for our last study group session. Okay. Thank you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.